Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Stanfield with NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, and I'm here today with Brian Odom, our Marshall historian, and we have a very special guest with us today. He's been with us all day. He spoke to a packed house in Morris Auditorium about his experiences during Apollo 13. We're honored to have astronaut Fred Haise with us today. Thank you for joining us.
It's been a great day. It's been a great day.
Yeah, it's been great for us too. To start us off here today, Brian's going to begin with a few questions, and then we're going to take questions from our Facebook feed. Brian?
Okay. Thanks, Jennifer. Fred, it's been a great day here with you, hearing you speak, getting to talk to you earlier as we did. A lot of good stories, a lot of good conversations. But I guess we'll get right into it. One of the most important things is, being selected in that early years. Tell me a little bit about how you came to the Apollo program.
Well, I got actually into the aviation business, not planned. I was actually majoring the first 2 years of college in journalism. And the Korean War came on, and I decided to serve. And the program I could get into at 2 years of college at my age was the Naval Aviation Cadet Program. Now, I had never been in an airplane in my life, but decided that was what I ought to do. Sometimes at 18 years old, you don't think too far ahead. But it turned out I loved flying from the first time I jumped on an airplane. I said instantly, I was on a new course, didn't quite know what the course was ultimately, but I knew flying was going to be my life somehow. Flying was going to be involved. I had served in the Marine Corps when I graduated from flight training and served in 2 Marine fighter squadrons. And just read a lot of books and talked to some of my leaders and decided I wanted to be a test pilot. So I went back to school to get an engineering degree, which is kind of a requirement to be in that position. And after I finished school and graduated, I applied to actually 3 NASA centers at Lewis Research Center, which is now Glenn in Cleveland, and to Langley Center, the Mother Center, and to Ames Research Center in California. All had flight test programs going on actively. And Lewis was the only center that had an opening. So I went to work with Lewis in 1959 as a research pilot, which NASA calls their test pilots. And basically I followed Neil Armstrong. Neil started at Lewis and eventually went to the NASA Flight Research Center at Edwards, which is now named after Neil, and then went into the astronaut program. So I was about 2.5 years behind in that circuit, behind Neil. And similarly, I ended up applying for the program when I was at NASA Flight Research Center in California, and was accepted and joined the group in 1966.
Okay. That's very interesting. Now, one of the things around here, you ride down the interstate out here and you see the big Saturn V. So everybody, I guess, wants to ask you, what's it like to ride on top of that Saturn V?
Well, I guess I'd say it really doesn't give you a fast getaway. Even though there's 5 engines that generate a lot of thrust, the entire stack weighs a lot. So it really doesn't move up and away very fast. Like, you'd get more of a kick in the pants if you were in a fighter airplane with an afterburner and you popped it in the burner to go down the runway. You'd feel bigger. But it keeps building the pressure or the G's, pressing you into the couch, because it's getting lighter. Every second it's burning tons of LOX and RP1, which was the propellant of that first stage. So you're getting lighter as it's going up, and the G's build to about 4.5 G's. They actually shut down on purpose the center engine early to maintain that G level, so you don't get about 4.5 at burnout, where the Saturn V first stage ends its job and you're separated and you go away. Now, it's quite a jolt when it quits. It's instant from the thrust it's producing at that point in time, which is built up to that level. You almost, if you weren't strapped in, you'd hit the instrument panel when that happens. The other unusual sensation from being a fighter pilot is the couches we laid in were suspended on actually shock absorbers, if you will, struts, and weren't tied on the sides, so that the couches we landed could move quite a bit. And the way that the engines gimbaled to steer the rocket, it gave us a lot of rocking around in the capsule because we're way up on top, which probably exaggerated that motion. So you got a lot of jerking around in the capsule going uphill on that first stage.
Yeah. That's cool. Well, I guess many people have seen the movie, right? Apollo 13. They know the story, kind of what happened. But from your perspective, what happened, and how did you respond to it, and kind of what was going through your mind at that time?
Well, at the time of explosion, we had essentially finished a work day, and we're fixing to bed down. And the next morning, we're going to get up and go into lunar orbit and prepare to go land. So that was the next day's schedule. And we had done a TV show, kind of show and tell, where we pulled out objects that we knew had not been talked about. And I was actually putting things away after the TV show when this happened. And Jack, who was all alone up in the mothership, the command service module, was asked to stir the cryos, which is to throw a switch that stirs like little egg beaters, if you think about it, in the cryogenic tanks. Why they do that is the fluid in there tends to stratify, and when you stir it up, you can get a more accurate quantity reading. So that was why the purpose of the stir. And there was an electric short, and we had an explosion in one of the two tanks, Tank 2. And that was where I was still in the landing craft. It was a loud bang through this metal structure. And very quickly, Jim was with me, Jim Lovell, the commander, and he already headed up to the command module. And I followed, and there was some motion between the vehicles. That was a twisting motion that caused a crinkling of metal in that tunnel where the two vehicles were connected. But that settled out even before I got through the tunnel and into the right seat. And very quickly, surveying the panel, realized by several instrument readings that we had lost Tank 2. So the motion right then was just a sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach because I knew we had lost the landing. It was an abort case if you lose one of any of the critical items. And that, without reference in the book, the mission rules, I knew that was an abort.
Yeah. Well, what was one of your first steps, I guess, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but you talked about the approach to solving the problem and how you were able to do that successfully.
Right. The mission control really did not get in the loop and realize this was a real problem for 18 minutes. We had so many caution warning lights on, 7 of them, master alarm and a blue computer restart light in addition. They assumed it was an instrumentation problem, that these lights were false and not representative of a real problem, because they crossed systems which were not connected in any way, and it just didn't seem possible that one failure would cause problems across that many systems at one time. And in the interim, we were busy trying to just keep electric power because the explosion had closed valves on 2 reactant valves on 2 of the fuel cells, 2 of the 3. So I was switching buses. We had A, B, and C, and I was cross-tying to try to keep things up because we didn't have enough power. We were fully powered up in the command module. So eventually, Mission Control had that realization, and also by then had recognized 2 things. One, that we really had this leaking tank, and furthermore, the second tank was starting to go down. They had better granularity in the readings. They could tell before we did. And Jim Lovell had reported a stream of debris going away from the spacecraft, a flow of some kind in the sunlight. So that caught him up to say, this is not instrumentation, this is the real McCoy. And so they then got into ferreting out and settled some of the warning lights, because they realized they had telemetry to valves, and the G-shock of the explosion had closed some valves that were normally open in some fluid and gaseous systems, flows. And so they had us recycle switches to reopen those valves, which we couldn't see on our panel. And that made quite a few of those lights go away. It's not a real problem, just the valves had moved. So then we were wrestling with mainly how to save the second oxygen tank, because without that supply, that remaining fuel cell was gone as well. Fuel cells need oxygen and hydrogen to operate. And so it was a lot of troubleshooting for about an hour period of trying to isolate the leak. And at the point, it was obvious we'd run out of ideas. And Jim Lovell and I moved to the landing craft to try to get it powered up as quickly as we could, because it was obvious they're going to have to shut down the mothership and the service module. We left Jack Swigert alone to worry about that, and we went to get the LEM powered up so we'd have communication, environmental system working, life support, and be able to continue to work the problem. So it's kind of like buying time. And the LEM turned out to come up and had no problems, had not been affected by the explosion. So immediately that brought us into a four-day home, and then to buy time for figuring out a lot of other things that had to get worked in that interim period.
Yeah. And definitely right before re-entry, when you have to power back up the command module, I mean, what were you worried about at that time?
Well, in general, I was worried about how the vehicle would perform to get through entry, at least accurately to get us to the landing place. It was kind of like it wasn't, again, a survival issue, because the way the entry could be made, you could really do it without almost any guidance, nav, and control. You just might miss the spot where you planned to be. But I worried because we had froze it for 4 days. The water tanks were frozen in that vehicle. They found them frozen when they recovered it on board the ship, on board the aircraft carrier. Still frozen. And so we abused the systems, the electronic systems in particular, violated specifications. And so it's really a question mark, how's this thing going to perform? And it was coated with water. It looked like somebody had come in there with a hose, fine spray, and sprayed everything. When Jack and I got in to power that up, we had to get a towel to wipe off the instrument panel so we could read the instruments, and we knew there was water probably behind everywhere and interspersed with the wiring, which was, of course, shorting the wirings would set off the fire on the Apollo 1 tragedy, where we lost the crew on the launch pad earlier. But part of that redesign they had done was to greatly improve the wiring insulation and hermetically sealing the connectors as part of the fix from that accident. So that really saved us. We did not obviously incur an electric short in what might have happened in another case of Apollo 1.
Thank you. There's a lot of lessons learned in Apollo 13. We have some questions coming in from our Facebook community. Sam Digweed says, legend. What was the best thing about Apollo 13 looking back on the mission?
I'm sorry, what was the best?
What was the best thing about the mission looking back on the mission?
Well, the best thing was we got back. we got back. And just like the Apollo 1 fire, there were redesigns as a result. Before Apollo 14 flew, they put in a LEM decent battery, which was the biggest battery. They added a cryogenic set of tanks on the opposite side of the service module, away from the bay. We had them all clustered together in one bay. We really didn't follow military discipline. In the military aircraft, if you have critical elements like that, you put them on different places in the airplane. Worrying about any aircraft fire, if it hits you, you don't want to knock out everything at once. So we didn't follow that protocol with the design. But at 14, they added some tankage on the other side, so they were safe. Again, if that happened again, they still had oxygen and hydrogen supply.
Josie Moore asks, what do you think about going back to the moon and going to Mars?
Well, I've sort of been mixed opposite from Buzz. Buzz Aldrin, my compatriot, has pushed, let's go to Mars. And I've always said we need to first, if we're going to go and stay, not just go and pick up some rocks and come back. We need to learn about developing the infrastructure to logistically support a permanent base, and certainly a lot easier place to do that learning is to the moon. So I've always been more in favor of going that route. It depends on how big a hurry you want to be in, and we obviously we want those kind of things happen quicker than maybe even possible from a budgeting standpoint, because we relatively have short lives. And but I think the long-range approach is to go to the moon, learn to build a supply. They say you could do mining on the moon, as well as science, and have a permanent establishment, much like we did early in Antarctica, as an example. And it's gonna take more than just one rocket and one capsule to do that. You're going to need to have waypoints at Earth and Moon, have vehicles that go between, that live their whole life in space, never come home, and landers that live on the Moon and up to a station and never come back. And so you're going to need that kind of infrastructure to pull off that kind of capability, to supply it, to bring people back and forth. If they mine, to bring ore back and forth. So that's the kind of thing you're going to need if you're that ambitious.
We've got a great question from Katja Michelle. She says, "Ciao from Italy. What does the Earth mean to you? Do you consider the Earth a spaceship?"
Yeah, definitely. The Earth is a spaceship that we're all perched on, moving within the solar system, which is obviously moving within the Milky Way. We're moving. The solar system is. And so certainly we're in a place that we need to preserve. And I think Apollo 8 took first pictures that gave people a sense of the beauty of the Earth, but also the picture of the thin atmosphere we have, and that we need to protect if we're going to be around here a long while.
We probably have time for just a couple more questions. PC Robinson asks, would you still join the space program if you had to do it all over again?
Yes, if I could lose a lot of years. Yeah, I would be happy to join the space program. I think I was at a pristine time, actually. We've really not had all the conditions and the push, if you will, that we had. Apollo was a unique program. And from the standpoint of support and funding, general public support with the mission, support all the way through Congress and administration. So I was lucky to be around at that time. But certainly, yeah, I'd join the space program again if I had to. I could shed about 50 years. Yeah.
Ilya Albert asks, and I think this is a good one to maybe stop with. What advice do you give individuals who want to be astronauts? I know you talk to kids a lot at the Infinity Science Center in your community. What advice do you give to them?
Well, the advice I give them is to obviously think about the requirements that are going to be in. It's kind of like two classes of astronauts. Right now, of course, the big thing is space station. And so it's not so much the test pilot for space station, it's more a scientist, because you're going to go live up there for a large number of months and conduct and support experiments that are going, so that then you have some skill and some education that best fits the kind of work you're going to be doing if you were up there. So we've kind of moved away from the Apollo days where there was a piloting role, and it was significant. Not so much during launch. We kind of just rode the rockets and hoped they worked. But the rendezvous, the landing on the moon, coming off the moon, all of that involved some degree of piloting. And so there's two paths. If you're going to end up with the capsule role, for Orion, that would be more the military experience, test piloting. Would fit mostly headed in that direction. For any kind of vehicles, you're going to have to be flying stick and rudder, we call it. And otherwise, a scientist. And there's a wide variety of skills that have been involved in the space station, from medical doctors, PhD engineers, these astronomers. I mean, every variety of scientists you can think of, I think, has probably flown on space station, which is coming up on 17 years continuously, 17 years with people aboard.
It's pretty amazing.
Yes.
It's been really amazing to have you with us today. We want to thank you for spending the time with us, both with our Marshall family and here with us on Facebook. For those of you watching at home, you can follow us on Facebook, NASA Marshall, or on Twitter, NASA_Marshall. Thanks so much for sticking with us and asking your questions. See you next time.